John Cardillo with The Rebel. I'm speaking with Carlos Reyes, who is challenging Debbie Wasserman Schultz, someone who is not very well liked in this CPAC 2018 crowd. I'm going to ask Carlos the question I ask every candidate. Why would you turn your life upside down and run for office?
John, what a great question. Ultimately, my answer is I love this country.
Amen.
I love my kids. I love my grandkids. And after enough years of seeing the craziness in South Florida, I decided that enough is enough and that ultimately someone had a challenger, someone that hasn't been a public servant in the sense of being at the public dole forever. I've actually been an attorney for 30 years, happily married 34 years, as I said, 3 kids and now 3 grandkids. And I realized what's happening in the country requires common sense. And Debbie is so out of touch with her constituents that I finally decided to step up and said, it's enough shouting from the sidelines. I want to shout where it might make a difference.
Now, you've been a member, you're a constituent of Debbie's.
Absolutely.
You're a constituent. So how long have you lived in the area?
More than 35 years.
So what happened under, I see Debbie, I live in the next district over, full disclosure. I see South Florida under people like Debbie Wasserman Schultz and Ted Deutsch being forgotten about. They went to D.C., they became very elite. You don't see your Congress people anymore, but I'm curious to hear from someone who lives in her district. I could look at the news and be a Politico and an on-air guy, but what do you see as a resident, as a business owner?
You know, one of the things that for years we're railing about was the lack of economic growth. And Debbie clearly has an agenda that is not pro-growth, but pro-government. And so as we were railing, those of us that worked in the private sector, talking about just the common sense things you had to do, tax cuts was just the tip of the iceberg, I believe. Because once you have a mindset about how you can change policy, how you can change the taxing plan in this country in order to allow businesses to flourish, you see what you saw in the first 6 months of 2017. A dramatic change in GDP. South Florida, for too long, relied just solely on tourism. If you do that, it's not going to be it's not going to be good for the economy, the local economy, and that certainly was the case in South Florida. So number one, I think that changing that mindset is important. Our congressperson has to talk about supporting businesses that creates jobs, and more jobs. Another thing is security. You know, in an age of terrorism, you can go to the Jewish community in South Florida and talk about the issues about how you support Israel, but then you turn around and you cut a single worst deal in the history of the United States in supporting the Iran deal. Things like that are just resonating throughout our community. People that are Jewish and non-Jewish are talking about how terrible a deal that was.
Not to mention compromising classified emails with your Pakistani IT guys who are now sitting in federal custody. Now, I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about a tragedy in South Florida, the same county we both live in last week. Of course, I'm talking about the terrible, terrible shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland. A lot of calls for gun control, but I think the Republicans are being both responsible and constitutional on this issue. I was very encouraged by what I saw the president do, by what I saw our state legislature do. They're talking to people, they're listening, but they're not emotionally reacting.
Absolutely. Compassion is not a one-party thing here. Compassion, as a father and grandfather, I immediately related to the circumstance. I realized you send your kids to be educated to school. You should not fear for their well-being in school. And so that tragedy is going to resonate in our community for a long time. But in the light of all the emotions, you still have to keep your head about you. You have to realize that when people talk about gun control, they're reaching for the low-lying fruit emotionally. They're not thinking through what the constitutional implications of that are. And ultimately, if you really want safety in the United States in schools, you have to focus on common sense things that really make a difference. For example, you have to be in these schools and you have to talk to people with a mindset of saying, put substations, police substations in schools. I mean, deal with that reality. Limit the number of entrances into schools. Put in metal detectors. The technology we have today to get things done is incredible. So while people would give these feel-good things that give you a sense of false security, there are those of us that talk about common sense reality, and in dealing in today's environment, more than ever, I think we need to look at that as the option and ultimately preserve our constitutional rights, because but for that, you know, many have died protecting our constitutional rights. Yeah. They ought not to be given away that easily.
You know, look, I'd agree with you. I had former Broward County Sheriff Al Lamberti, the last Republican to hold office on my show, and he mirrored one of your comments. And one of his points was, when he was sheriff, he would have deputies respond to a large school. Stoneman Douglas had several thousand students, a couple of hundred faculty. He said, look, this is a small neighborhood, rather a small city. This is a large neighborhood. I had deputies responding to schools as much as to some housing developments. So why not have officers, deputies in every school? It would also, in addition to protecting the school, it takes the taxing off of other police resources. That's a state and local issue, but schools do see federal Homeland Security dollars, often for school resource officers. If you were in Congress, is that something you would be behind budgeting?
Absolutely. It was sort of interesting. In this morning's CPAC session, President Wayne LaPierre spoke about, the NERA president spoke about how 3 years ago he had called for exactly this, putting substations in schools. This was 3 years before this incident in Parkland. It seems to me that some people get caught up in these political ideologies. It's sad to me that we have people talking about taking a tragedy and using it for the very purpose of politicizing it. That ought not to be the issue. Common sense, what do you have to do to protect our kids? So to me, it's very common today, with all the technology that we have, to be creative, to go out there and use that. I think it's important, it's imperative that we do it in a compassionate way and understanding. But I think people realize that 1 + 1 has to equal 2. So if you want security, you put in the measures that enforce security. You have foyers that lead into schools. You limit the entrance. You put in metal detectors, and you actually arm at least police officers at the schools. And then you think beyond that, what else might make sense to protect our kids?
Right. Look, I'm a big fan of and I want to get your opinion on this. After 9/11, after the attacks of September 11, we gave airline pilots the option to be armed. Nobody forced them, but back then, President Bush understood in his cabinet that many airline pilots were former military, former law enforcement, and they said, hey, we're going to create the Federal Flight Deck Officer Program. If you're comfortable, we are going to allow you to be armed. I see that as a common sense measure. Look, I know I was a law enforcement guy. Plenty of friends of mine retired, became teachers. These are very well trained, very competent, experienced cops. Many teachers are reservists in the military. They train with weapons every weekend. I see that as a logical solution. Set up a program much like the Federal Flight Deck Officer Program. Curious about your thoughts on that.
Well, listen, you said common sense. At least it's common sense to have the discussion. In our country today, freedom of speech is under attack. Just the fact that someone may even suggest that gets attacks from the left and the right sometimes. And the reality is we ought to at least have the conversation about everything and anything. Everything ought to be on the table. So for very purposes, so if we discuss these things, we actually make a decision. I'm not sure that you want teachers being armed, but if a teacher says to us, listen, I would be comfortable being armed. I would take a training. You'd have to implement some kind of a training program.
Yeah, much like the flight deck officers. They had to be trained by the federal. The pilots received the same training federal law enforcement officers received. It was intensive.
Well, that makes sense. Under that circumstance, if you have teachers that realize that they're really on the front lines, then that would make sense. And so you want to go through that process. And what I would say to you is that in Congress, I would support some of the things that actually end up with results. There's a great phrase that says, don't confuse effort with results. Right. And that's what people are sick and tired of both parties having a lot of talk but no action. That's what we want, results.
Really can't say it any better myself. Carlos Reyes running against Debbie Wasserman Schultz in Florida's 23rd Congressional District. Thanks very much. For all of your CPAC 2018 coverage, stay tuned to The Rebel, and don't forget to subscribe to our premium service at www.therebel.media/shows, and go to your app store, check out the Rebel app.